Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever this finds you in the world today. And welcome to the next in our series of webinars, exploring topics highlighted by IAVE's research regarding the experience and response of leadership for volunteering organizations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we are discussing the very important topic of partnership and collaboration for volunteering, exploring the benefits of working together to achieve better outcomes. In this webinar, we will be drawing on IAVE's research, Leadership for Volunteering, the COVID-19 experience, and the associated briefing paper on partnership and collaboration for volunteering, which you have each been sent as part of your invite and is also on IAVE's website at iave.org. Of course, we all know partnership and collaboration are important, now more than ever, as we become a global society, a global connected society. But what helps create and sustain these partnerships? What are the challenges and the out-of-the-box thinking about how we can bring stakeholders together for even greater impact? And what lessons have we learned about how partnership and collaboration will influence support for volunteering in the future? Support for a volunteering that is inclusive, just, and sustainable. These are just some of the items we will be unpacking today. But before we introduce our speakers, let's take a moment to understand IAVE's research and what it told us about partnership and collaboration within volunteer leadership sector during the pandemic. But I have the next slide on disruptive innovation. So when we did this research, in which we talked to over 70 national volunteer organizations around the world, we took into account that this was not just COVID-19 they were experiencing, but rather a landscape of disruption that included the pandemic, most certainly and most immediately. But it was also within the background of a climate crisis, one that had been unfolding for many years and one that had been increasingly exacerbated. And the third component to this was the issue of inequality that surfaced greatly over the last 2 years, had always been there, had always been a part of our everyday lives, but which got frequent and needed attention in the way resources are distributed globally. So when we talk about transformational leadership, next slide, please, we must remember that it is very much in and within a constant context of change and disruption. And what our research found is that amidst this disruption, there was this notion of transformative leadership, that the leaders who were part of these volunteer organizations found ways to cope, and they found ways to innovate and not just survive, but thrive. Certainly that included values-driven advocacy, support for developing others, showcasing innovation, and leading change. But today we're going to be focusing on that second emerging factor, and that's this culture of collaboration that emerged, strengthened, and found new ways to materialize during this pandemic. Next slide, please. So what did it say? What it said was that these leaders, amidst COVID, amidst climate, amidst inequality, really looked at growing their partnership and coalitions because they saw that as a way to succeed and thrive and get people to safety and more deeply and more effectively engage volunteers. Great numbers of them were involved in coalitions around advocacy. They spotted areas of inclusivity, areas where volunteers were prevented historically from being engaged. And they used this time to lead and build multi-sector coalition to address those concerns and to raise their voices about what they saw. They became part of coalitions to increase mobilization of volunteers around the pandemic and about responding to basic needs, and even later on around vaccine hesitancy and the distribution of vaccines. Also, they deepened their coalition and partnership with government and the private sector. And this is what became really instrumental in leading that global voice about a seat at the table for volunteering and for the volunteering sector in government and in the private sector as we emerge from this pandemic. That it was no longer okay to have volunteering as a side event, but rather raising the voices to government about its accountability to include volunteering in its schemes around the development of civil society, around the private sector to resource and engage in authentic partnerships. So these are just some of the elements IAVE found as it looked across the notion of partnership and collaboration. Now let's hear what our panelists have to say. This webinar will seek to bring together 4 presentations from a diversity of volunteering leadership to showcase experience around partnership. We will hear from Helge Espe of NOREC, Carolina Ferreira of the Volunteers of Panama, Dieter Guerra from CNV Mozambique, and Alan Stevenson of Volunteer Scotland. Each presentation will last 10 minutes, and it will be followed by a moderated discussion of questions and answers from you all. So please do put any questions in the chat function so we can be sure to raise those to our panelists. And now, without any further delay, let me introduce our first panelist, Helge Espe. Helge is Senior Advisor at the Norwegian Agency for Exchange Cooperation, or NOREC, where he looks after volunteering and exchange schemes regarding Agenda 2030, South-South partnership, and triangulation cooperation, as well as international think tanks, networks, and associations on volunteering, including Volunteer Groups Alliance and Research Policy and Practice Learning Group. Helge has previously worked in Ethiopia for 11 years as the resident representative of Norwegian Save the Children. Helge, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Nicole, thank you very, very much. Thank you for this invitation. And let us jump straight on the topic of partnership. I think it is easy to argue that partnership is essential in today's world of volunteering and in development cooperation in general. We see that volunteering agencies, organizations, businesses, they cooperate about sending and receiving volunteers in finance, in research, in advocacy, event organization, and in other ways. Obviously, through partnership, one can take advantage of the complementary skills and resources of several actors, and we can achieve together what we cannot do on our own. It's obviously a necessary skill for volunteer leaders to be able to bring together a variety of different parties and make them work together. So as you can see on the slide, NOREC launched recently a report, Partnership, Just Another Buzzword, which goes through the evolution and use of the concept in a development cooperation context. It is stated that partnership has in some ways become a buzzword, which covers a range of relations, and more often than not, the precise meaning is not defined. If we take SDG 17 as an example, rather than an operational goal, it has become a sort of a banner for general support to international cooperation, even with emotional overtones, the expression of feelings, commitment, and common ground. As a word, partnership gives positive connotations, but there is a lack of conceptual clarity. And sometimes perhaps service contracting even is a more appropriate word to describe reality than partnership. So in the following, I would like to look at partnership in volunteering in the context of international development cooperation. And I would like to start with some reflections about the relationship between partnership, power, and learning. And the next slide, please, would be good. In the current discourse on decolonization, important aspects of partnerships are equality, reciprocity, and fair distribution of power between the parties. This is not only a moral imperative of fairness, but also a more effective way to create ownership and therefore, in turn, sustainability. Knowledge of how to facilitate, support, and maintain fair power balance in partnerships will be a crucial volunteering leadership skill for the years ahead to 2030. How can a partnership take advantage of the strengths of each actor, build a complementary network, and still maintain values such as respect for each other and an equally shared power? Volunteering can be a powerful tool to build and exchange knowledge over a range of technical sectors. To have the right knowledge and skills in the right place is essential to overcome bottlenecks and achieve the SDGs, and partnerships in volunteering can be a key factor here. But the traditional international volunteering framework has been one of transfer of skills and knowledge, especially from the global north volunteers to the south. But as the slide states, who is really the teacher and who is the learner? In the English language, to teach and to learn are two different words. This may perhaps lead us to think that in a partnership, teaching and learning are two different roles. However, in my own native tongue, Norwegian, to teach and to learn is the same word. This could in a nice way symbolize that in real life, we cannot distinguish one of these roles clearly from the other. It points to a concept of knowledge less as a package to be transported and more as a process, an interwoven process which is facilitated in a dialogue, in a partnership. So the practical implication of that is that everyone in a partnership has the potential to bring some knowledge to the table. Especially on the implementation side, that knowledge will more often than not be the most relevant and appropriate knowledge. In order to secure ownership and sustainability, the value of that knowledge has to be recognized. One would perhaps think that the principles of equality and reciprocity would be held especially high in the civil society sector, with its many activists and spokesperson NGOs campaigning for ideal causes, and many of them with an overall decolonization agenda. But interestingly, in the NUREC report I mentioned, it is stated that civil society volunteers from the global south, more or less as a matter of course, assumed the role of learners, and that their Norwegian counterpart naturally slid into the role as teachers. And interestingly, this was not reported so much for the corporate sector volunteers. In corporate-based volunteering, one may perhaps not pay too much attention to ideological principles, but the volunteers in this sector rated better on recognition of their value and contributions. And this shows that good intentions are not enough to achieve equal and reciprocal partnerships. Competent volunteering leadership is required as well. So the key skill of volunteering leaders of today and tomorrow will be to facilitate and bring out the relevant knowledge that everyone possesses. So I leave to yourselves to answer the questions on the slide here. And we'll jump to the next slide. Same as for human relationships, a real volunteering partnership could be seen as a multidimensional concept as compared to a unidimensional one. In Norek's portfolio, there are several illustrations of the advantages of embedding volunteer exchange into a deeper and thematic-based home-host relationship with multiple dimensions. And this also proved more resilient during the pandemic. An example we can see here, the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Center, WE Center, based in Kenya, is managing electronic waste safely for sustainable development. They have formed a partnership with Wuhitra Sarl in Madagascar, the company offering solutions adapted to the local economy while preserving the environment. So these are similar companies. Within the framework of volunteer exchange, both companies learn from each other by discussing ideas of research about handling of e-waste, about innovative practices, and other business issues that provide them with the opportunity to do better in as businesses and even scale them up. These two companies also campaign together to inform the public about the environmental and health risks posed by electronic waste. They work together to stimulate greater awareness among the public. And at the same time, they try to create more demand for the services of both companies. So they also work together on policy input for their respective governments in the two countries on adoption of relevant regulations for this sector. So over a period of 3 years, each of these companies have sent 6 of their own staff to volunteer with the other for a period of a year. They share their knowledge with the host partner and bring home to their own employer what they have learned. So there is a balance of learning and teaching. The main advantage of this volunteering model is that the knowledge gain and exchange is being anchored in the respective institutions, both on the sending and receiving side. The knowledge doesn't go away when the individual terminates his or her volunteer contract. So volunteering, corporate volunteering serves here as an element in a broader and multi-dimensional partnership, which, as I said, proved very resilient during the pandemic. They could cooperate not only on one, but on several dimensions. So we can have the last slide, please. So in the volunteering world, we can think of partnerships covering a multitude of fields at the same time, like finance, advocacy, webinars and conferences, leadership development, volunteer courses, research, thematic conversations. And such partnerships place high demand on volunteering leadership. One needs the skill to pull together thematic diversity. The way I see the years ahead to 2030, the ability to manage multidimensional partnerships along with equal and fair partnerships will be a key skill for volunteer leaders to excel in. And we have to support such leadership development. So thank you. I will pass to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Helge. And I think your discussion illuminates a very pressing issue of equality and inclusion in all of our partnerships, not just North-South, South-North, but even within the constituencies of the beneficiaries our programs serve. So thank you for this. We will definitely be picking this issue up in the question and answer. And just to say that from Ayave's research, we found this exact same thing as well, that because of safeguarding issues and the prevention from some international volunteers sending organizations, the organizations like 3 of our panelists today, part of Ayave's global network for volunteer leadership, folks who had been in place in that country, often saw a greater attention from their governments with the recognition that they had been there, they were there, and they were going to stay. So this notion of really recognizing the systems and structures that are in place is very important. And we will be getting to that in our question and answer. Thank you, Helge. Now I would like to move on to our next panelist. Carolina Ferreira founded Volunteers of Panama, an organization that mobilizes and connects the Panamanians with causes and organizations that need them. She is a social protection and health specialist with the Inter-American Development Bank. She has a degree in international politics from Georgetown University and has a master's degree in public policy from the University of Texas. Carolina is a fellow of the Aspen Institute, the Young Global Leader 2012 of the World Economic Forum. We very much look forward to your participation, Carolina, today, and I now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and I apologize in advance if you hear some background noise. I'm in not the perfect setting for the seminar, but I did not want to miss the opportunity to share with you our experience of partnerships in response to COVID. So you can go to the next slide. As Nicole mentioned, our organization is an umbrella organization that works with over 200 nonprofit partners and leaders in the country in different causes and mobilizing volunteers to all these different organizations. And during the pandemic, we established a partnership with an organization called Todo Panama, which means all of Panama, which was created and led by the private sector together with other nonprofit organizations in order to combat COVID through prevention and other mitigation strategies. The movement is led mostly, like I said, by the private sector, but it also became another umbrella organization that brought together many actors to see how the country could respond from the civil society sector to the pandemic. So we worked with Todo Panama since it began its founding in the middle of the pandemic, but then we developed a special partnership to mobilize volunteers for the vaccine response. Next slide, please. So the objective of the partnership with Todo Panama was to support the national government in its effort to fully vaccinate the adult population against COVID-19. Panama was one of the countries that had the most severe lockdown in the region, but it was also very successful in securing very early on vaccination, at least for the eligible adults at the beginning. However, there were challenges related to the rollout of the vaccine process. And even though the public sector was doing all it could at the nationwide level, it did enlist the support of nonprofits and the private sector in partnership to be able to do this faster in a more efficient way. So Todo Panama entered into a partnership with the government and then ourselves with them to support their efforts first to register eligible adults for vaccination. We operated kiosks or booths nationwide in our 9 provinces. Our country is divided into 9 provinces. So we equipped, with the help of Todo Panama, we equipped different points of mass transportation like metro stations, bus stations, malls, and other places of great population points with kiosks where we could register people for vaccination. And so what volunteers would do, as you can see in the pictures, is to support people who didn't have internet, who didn't have cell phone access, who didn't have internet access, to register in the government website for their vaccine appointment. So that was one level of support. And then the second level of support was that we deployed volunteers to private hospitals that were authorized by the government to vaccinate eligible adults. And so volunteers, as you could see in the pictures, assisted citizens in the process of registering themselves when they attended the private hospital, answering their questions, filling out their paperwork, and also supporting people with disabilities and older adults. Next slide, please. And like I mentioned before, we did this all through partnerships, which is the topic of this important webinar, because we knew that by ourselves, we would not be able to access all the platforms that, you know, that in the situation of COVID, had to have protocols, had to have security, had to have a whole framework for developing volunteering. And so we did this in an organized manner through partnerships with Todo Panama and the national government. So partnerships were definitely key in this way. Next slide, please. And the results that I could talk about of volunteer mobilization that we did was in 2 stages. Like I mentioned before, for the vaccine registration, as you can see in the picture, we have the volunteers in the malls, in the public transportation sites, the metro. We had 109 volunteers working in booths. We had volunteers, 23 volunteers working in the metro. This process went on for about 3 or 4 months. Also in infrastructure sites, in government health zones that were special, like health zones that the government habilitated for information exchange. And we were able to mobilize 141 volunteers that donated over 8,000 hours and contributed to registering close to 20,000 people for their vaccination appointment. Next slide. And then once people registered in mass for the vaccination, then we continued to support this partnership in the private hospitals. So we had volunteers working in 8 private hospitals that were subscribed a partnership with the government to support the vaccination process. And like I mentioned before, they helped in registration, verification, filling out vaccine forms, providing orientation and support to vulnerable populations to get their vaccine. So we mobilized a total of 105 volunteers that worked recurringly for several weeks and several months and mobilized over 22,000 hours supporting the process of vaccination for 129,000 people in the country. I think that's my last slide, but I did not want to close without mentioning that the Latin American Center for Volunteering Effort, CELAVE, which is headed by a very valued partner of ours from Mayave, Dacila Acevedo, managed to conduct a survey in the middle of the pandemic about the support that volunteers were giving, not only our organization, but many organizations were providing during the pandemic. And they found that alongside religious organizations, the government, volunteers were the most valued actor in the pandemic response. Over 80% of the population mentioned that they valued very positively the support of volunteers. And definitely we couldn't have been able to mobilize these volunteers successfully without those key partnerships that were indeed necessary in the context of a global pandemic to be able to do the volunteer activities. And I'm open to questions and happy to respond to them in the break.
Thank you so much, Carolina. That was a really fabulous, short but impactful presentation. And we're delighted to have you under any circumstances. You brought up something that I think is so important here, and that's the credibility and legitimacy of volunteers. That is our currency. And I think what often gets overlooked, if I'm being honest, in some of these partnerships is people not really recognizing and understanding that volunteers have the relationships, the connectivity, and the influence on the ground to be able to really participate and succeed where some are not able to. So we'll get back to that, but I'm really, really glad that you highlighted that in the end. And that is a really incredible statistic that you left us with, about that 80% of people felt that volunteers were just really so credible and so big a part of this vaccine distribution. Excellent finding. Thank you, Carolina. And let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is also a member, in addition to Panama, of IAVE's Global Network for Volunteer Leadership Organizations. Dieter Guerra has been a volunteer since 2009, when he led a foundation of a nonprofit organization called Adesso. In 2015, he started an active collaboration with the National Council, Volunteering Council, or CNV, leading the process of its revitalization. In 2018, he was elected vice president of CNV, where he leads the design and implementation of projects, cooperations, and partnerships. Currently, Dieter is also advisor to the State Secretariat for Youth and Employment, where he provides technical assistance to the volunteering department on various matters, with emphasis on the establishment of a national volunteering program framework and partner organization. I am exceedingly proud to have worked with Didar and to have been able to hear some of what he's been doing over the last 2 years. And I now invite him to share that with you. Didar?
Thank you very much, Nicole. Greeting from Mozambique. Concretely, good afternoon from Mozambique. My name is Didar Guerra, as Nicole mentioned. I'm from Mozambique, and let me apologize in advance because in Mozambique our official language is Portuguese, so my English is not very good, but just focus on what I will be saying. We can move to the next slide, please. Yes, so in this first slide, I want to highlight that the creation of CNV is a fruit or result of partnership and collaboration. As you can see in the top, on the top we have the logo of CNV, and on the bottom we have 4 logos. This means that the creation of CNV was a result of partnership and collaboration between the government, represented by the Ministry of Youth and Employment, Ministry of Youth and Sports, which now is State Secretariat for Youth and Employment, but also Red Cross, VSO, and UN volunteers. So it was founded in 2008, and the role of CNV is to lead advocacy, but also capacity building and coordination among its member organizations. So up to now, we have something around 300 plus members who are essential VIOs. We are talking about community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, but also NGOs. And here is very important to say that in our reality here in Mozambique, most of our volunteers are informal. So this is a hybrid movement, but in terms of the segment of organizations who compose CNV, these are the main members. Next, please. So some of our main activities and achievements are highlighted here. For example, we can see on the right, by the guidance of CNV, but also in collaboration with the government. Now in Mozambique, we have the volunteering law with its regulation. So this was approved in 2011. And here it's important to mention that within the parliament, this was something consensus. It was approved by, it was a unanimous consensus. So that is also another indicator that CNV is leading this process of making understand to make understand our government leaders about the role of volunteering. And we can also see on the bottom there is a picture. This young man is the State Secretary for Youth and Employment. And what is happening? What was happening here? This is very interesting because as CNV, what we do, as I said, we are not an implementing organization. We are promoters of volunteering, you know. So what happened with COVID-19, there were different interventions, and we support all of them. We're talking about in terms of raising awareness to people, but also to try to address the issue of misinformation and many other interventions. But this is very interesting because in this picture, we have the State Secretary in the ceremony of delivering of the first hand washing machine operated by food. So here is very interesting achievement for us because in that period, one of the challenges was how to wash hands but without touching the tap, you can say. So we had a young people organization, member of CNV, who tried to design something, a machine operated by food, but they had no resources. So what we did, we engaged Ayave. As Nicole said, we are a member of Ayave, of the GNVL platform. So we talked with Ayave, but also Good Deeds there, but also and another organization which is an NGO called World GVC. And the World GVC in that time they had some budget, to buy normal buckets with stabs, but we convinced them to support the development of this. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had some technical issues. So in this sermon, the state secretary was delivering this hand washing machine, and here is important to mention that from this experience, that youth organization signed a contract with several municipalities, and now they provided this equipment for around 70 markets, so, and they got a lot of money. And still in the bottom in the right, this is a picture that shows some of key intervention here. We are in Mozambique, we are facing with terrorist insurgents in the northern region. And at the same time, we are also facing climate disasters. So in this picture, we have a volunteer who is working with children in a place where we have some displaced families. So these displaced families are facing both terrorist violence, but also climate change issues. So these are some interventions that we are trying to promote within the scope of our role as promoters of volunteering. But it's also important to mention that we have organized some volunteering award ceremonies to recognize some volunteers, but also another actors who support volunteering in partnership with VSO and other NGOs. We are talking about member organizations. We also provide training to volunteers, and of course, we try to engage. We promote the engagement of volunteering to fight against natural disasters. But I also mentioned COVID-19, armed violence. But we have another similar challenge. We're talking, for example, about the early marriage. So we have our organization are working in different sectors related to the development in order to achieve the SDGs. But also we have another important achievement in our existence is that we are connected globally. So we are talking about IAVI GNVL platform, but we are also members of Forum, Good Deeds Day, and the Volunteer Link platform within through the African Union. So now we are working in close with the support from IAVI and the Good Deeds Day. We are working with the government on to establish what will be our first national volunteering program. So this is a very important step, because here it's important to mention that one of the key challenges in our advocacy is the understanding of the government itself about the role of volunteering. But fortunately, when our national director attended the IFCO in Kigali, his understanding about volunteering changed. You can say that it improved very much, because he understood that when we are talking about volunteering, we're talking about education and civil vital areas of the development. So now we are collaborating with the government in the establishment of this national volunteering program. Next, please. Yes, so here I'm trying to bring about some challenges, lesson learned from the COVID-19 experience. One of them was there was an understanding about the need of working together against a common enemy, which was COVID-19, because here in Mozambique, we had no experience in dealing with this kind of challenge, and I believe in the entire world. But another important thing was the balance in terms of treatment between international organizations, but also national and national volunteers and organizations. Because traditionally here in Mozambique, we have agents like JICA, but also VSO, who bring volunteers from the global north. And the feeling of volunteers in the field of that there is a different treatment between international volunteers. They have better treatment instead of the national volunteers. And what happened was that when COVID-19 started, most of the international volunteers had to go back, and their programs their work had to be continued, but by national volunteers. So there was a clear understanding about the importance on the need to invest also in the national volunteering. But we had also some evolving of technical partnership. Myself, I must confess that I was not more familiar to Zoom. I was reluctant in dealing remotely. So there was a need to embrace technology, but also knowledge sharing. As Nicole was saying, I had the privilege to be one of the first benefits of the IAVE mentorship program. So it was very amazing, and it was a very good opportunity through which I knew I think I had a very close relationship with IAVE, but with Nicole in particular. So it was very interesting. But also the value to remote volunteering and partnership. So we are doing a lot of work remotely. So it was also in partnership and also the collaboration. Yes, there is a need, because here in Mozambique, in our reality, we have a situation in which our government, because of the limitation of resources, the investment in volunteering is very limited in terms of resources. So we have partners, or even in CNV, we have members who are very big than CNV itself. When you're talking about, for example, Red Cross or VSO. So there is a need to address this gap of capacity or capability. There is a need to be more proactive, but also innovative, versatile, but also transparent when we are working in partnership. So if I am, for example, I'm a small organization, but if I come up with something which is very innovative, because one of the advantages that I have as a nation is that I know clearly and deeply the situation or the reality here in Mozambique. So if I come up with an initiative, it's more likely to be embraced by an international organization or another partners who can see that work as a very strategic means to achieve his goals as an organization. In terms of power balance, so yes, we need to come up with proposals that add value to the role of our partners. This means that we, in another hand, or in one hand, we need to have mastery in what we are proposing, but at the same time, we must also have a willingness to learn new experiences, but also new techniques and so on. In negotiation, we need to be we need to have integrity, but also conviction in what we are talking. So these are some experience that I have, but we have many challenges. For example, we have the challenge about the competition between the organizations. Sometimes when you have funding opportunities, we can be in a situation of applying for the same opportunities, and sometimes this create something about a selfish relationship between the competitors. So as CNV, we have tried to promote some consortium between organizations. For example, 3 or 4 organizations, they apply for the same project. So this is what we have done to address these situations. So this is what I can share now about the experience of CNV and myself about this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dieter. Thank you for that. Again, this panelist has brought to this conversation some very, very important concepts which we will pick up. And this is that notion of the balance of power and how we make sure our partnerships are achieving that balance of power when in society, that balance of power is not often shared. We will be a warning to panelists. We will be picking up that very conversation when we get to the question and answer, and to seek your insight into that very important conversation about how we achieve it. Let me first introduce our next panelist and our final panelist, also an IAVE Global Network for Volunteer Leadership member, Alan Stevenson. Alan is CEO of Volunteer Scotland, where he recently led more than 100 sector stakeholders, including colleagues from the Scottish Government, in the development of a successful launch of Scotland's 10-year volunteering action plan. Alan regularly represents the interests of volunteers and persuades sector leaders of the value of their role in delivering volunteering for all. Alan has a strong background in organizational management with over 20 years of experience as a management consultant and management educator. With that, I introduce Alan and welcome him to the panel.
Thank you, Nicole. And apologies in advance, Jessica, I've got so many slides. And I am going to try and ask you to go next slide quite a lot. So, so if you could maybe push it on 2 slides, if that's okay. That's us. Yeah, so we've created a plan, as Nicole said, over the next 10 years, and we've involved quite a diverse range of stakeholders across the sector. But where did this come from? What is the context for the plan? Well, we were approached probably early in 2021 by the Scottish Government, around about February, and they had asked us to help them take forward the plan. Normally, plans and frameworks and so on in Scotland would be led by Scottish Government, and I suppose the normal way of writing a plan would be to get stakeholders into the room, get their views facilitated, written up, and then turned into a report or a plan that I think maybe sits in a shelf somewhere. It's referenced once in a while. It's probably not something that people would leaf through regularly. And so one of the things that we were keen to do, as well as being asked to help with this, was to ensure that whatever we were going to do was going to be a meaningful piece of work. The context as well, in terms of just the shift in relationship between ourselves and government, I suppose that was probably the pandemic. We'd come out of a period with working very closely with our colleagues in Scottish Government through regular engagement. We were probably meeting with Scottish Government colleagues on a weekly or more frequent basis. So actually, rather than thinking of Scottish Government as being our funder and that normal, I was going to say, power dynamic that exists, we felt that there was a good level of mutual trust. So co-creation for us felt right, and working with Scottish Government to help deliver this plan, I think, felt the right time and the right approach as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background on the plan itself. We have a framework which precedes this, which gives us the overall themes for volunteering in Scotland, and it also allowed us to create 5 outcome areas around volunteering, which we've managed to integrate into what we call national performance frameworks. So it's really how everything is measured around public sector. So from community development to poverty and so on and so forth. So we have volunteering outcomes that fit very closely to some of those wider societal challenges. So really what we were trying to do through the action plan was to take that down into a level of, as it suggests, actions on the ground, to ensure that we had the basis for stakeholders to improve key elements of volunteering. And we'll come on to what the plan means in a little bit. We also were keen that what we call a systems view was taken through the planning process, that we didn't just go out and have or try and capture ideas from perceived experts. This is what you should be doing. But what we were trying to do through the plan was to try and really understand what the issues were, and to understand how dynamic situations, just like the pandemic, can change our views on what actions are appropriate at different times. So how would the plan allow us to flex and change to the demands of our environment, which, as you know, over the last period have been pretty uncertain. Next slide, please. So, as Nicole said, we involved more than 100 people in this action planning process. I would probably say around about 60 were actively involved, regularly involved, spent quite a lot of time actually in a variety of different ways. We were keen that our partners represented volunteering in a kind of wider sense, and I think, you know, we were reasonably successful. I don't think we were wholly successful in that, but certainly we had key stakeholders in there from Scottish Government, local councils, which would be our kind of local level government, national leadership bodies, and then into our volunteer involving organisations from large charities, and we had some grassroots organisations and community groups in there as well. We also had some representation from private sector and NHS. Sorry, next slide. Next slide is, I just want to bring this to life. Sometimes you're right, there's 100+ partners involved. It doesn't really give you a sense of who was involved and so on. So I don't think they would mind at all that I share their images. So this is just some of the people who were involved over a long period. Next slide. So I suppose one of the sort of first things we thought about around the partnership work was actually creating some kind of structure around that. We really tried to avoid this partnership work because it involves so many people to be what we would call talking shops. It would get lots of people together. They would talk at length, but actually not really take us towards real action. And I think there was a real danger in that. So we created a structure that involved a management team, that's essentially ourselves and Scottish Government, a governance group, and that involved sector stakeholders who would put in place that kind of governance and set in terms of steering of the overall project. How quickly were things moving? Were we covering all the issues we should be at different points? And then the working groups, each took one of the key outcome areas and tried to create actions out of that. We also created a range of outputs over a period of time, from high-level outcomes about what is this piece of work, through to who's involved in this area that I'm looking at, through to how do things work, how are outcomes achieved, what does the system look like, to what sort of initiatives should we be thinking about, and how do we begin to really put detail under these initiatives in terms of appraise, resource these initiatives and so on. Next slide, please. The management team themselves, which was ourselves and Scottish Government, were pretty busy over this period, and it was a bit of a vernacular here, a moving feast. Our plans were evolving as the group's needs changed. So we had group and participant resources that we put in place, a handbook to help participants in their groups, lunch and learn sessions. We tried to find ways to bring materials into sort of real bite-sized chunks for people, which people could pick up at times that suited them. We had evidence sessions that were honed into particular areas, so people had the evidence to hand and knew where to go for more information. A resource library online that was open to everyone, and anything around support was just picked up on almost like a support centre. Questions would come in, we would ensure that those were responded to, and all around that was communications. And I suppose that maybe points to one of the first issues about partnership as a management team. There was that we're dealing with our funder, and there's a power dynamic, and I suppose we had to be really clear on what our responsibilities were and what our roles were, and not make assumptions, and also maybe not play into the existing power dynamic, almost saying we are funded by you, so we'll do all of this. We had to be really honest and say, we've only got this amount of resource. We think you'd be better doing these things. And as we went on, that became much easier. It became much more of us rolling our sleeves up together, and we would actually just offer up what we would do at different points. And that was, a step change for us in terms of the relationship. Sorry, next 2 slides, please. So this is just to give you an idea about what the plan was and what some of these outputs were. I'm not going to go into this detail by any means, but this is a system map. It's actually a simplified version. But this was important. This was what our groups had come up with. All of our 5 working groups had gone off and explored different perspectives on the same question. How does volunteering happen? How do we make more volunteering happen in the right ways? That inclusive volunteering and volunteering for all. And this is what they were discussing, exploring, conceptualizing, and eventually this is what they pulled together as a group. This is our view of the system. And it's a view of the system that's a starting point, that's something that we can build on, but it's almost almost like that phrase, stepping on top of the shoulders of giants. But we've done some of that early thinking, so now we're refining and we're building on our shared understanding. Next slide, please. These are the tough slides, Jessica, bear with us. This is the plan. This is almost like an architecture, a 1-page plan of the plan. This is the sort of stuff that we needed to get into this plan, and this is where our discussions, and this is the work of the groups. So at one level, our work was around impact and the impact that volunteering has, but then it was also about the invisibility of volunteering and where policy influence was really important and that our policy work was impactful. A kind of sort of next iteration of that was around funding for success, and ensuring that we have funding standards in place, that we measure impact appropriately, and also that we are creating an environment where we can react, where we can be resilient, where we can come up with the next actions, where we can think about what's required next year rather than what's just now. So we brought all of this stuff, leadership, evidence and voice learning, capacity building, resilience, digital volunteering, into this idea of an enabling environment. And then finally, this enabling environment was really allowed the work of not just the working groups, but actually allowed our work going forward. So next slide, please. Yep, so the plan is a living plan. It's going to allow us to act over the next 10 years. Our concepts, our principles in there, our actions are experimental in some levels. The support around the plan is dynamic. Learning is at the heart of this. Partnership and collaboration is at the heart. And so this learning, this living plan is absolutely critical to our volunteer action plan moving forward. Sorry, next slide. And that involves new structures. And as I say, new structures, things that don't exist already. This is what's going to change because this plan is in place. And it's going to allow us to take actions. So we've got a policy champions network planned, underway. We have a cross-government policy group. Government itself helps us to make volunteering more visible across policy areas. We'll begin work around a funders consortium. So bring funders into the room around the system map, around understanding their impacts and their responsibilities around that, as well as listening to what their issues are and their perspectives. We're talking about a national learning community being at the heart of this. So this is where involving organisations can really learn, but also offer their learning as well. And it's where these actions and the what would say, evaluation or the feedback from those actions and the learning lessons will happen as well in that learning community. And there's a range of other structures as well. If we can push on to the next slide, please. And just to kind of sum up, we've got a number of lessons, I think, and this is really just my take, or our take over the last year of what we've learned from partnership and collaboration. And maybe that'll chime with some of the stuff that Helge was saying earlier on, and also Carolina and Dida. If you can put on to next slide. So very quick and fast, this was an evolving process. And I think, as I look at plans now, I see a different type of planning. I see planning that is thinking about learning, that is thinking about how do you change and flex. And that's not about poor planning and and not doing things well. That's about doing things quickly and failing fast and learning lessons. I think that's the space that most of us are going to be in. Just interesting small things. The quality of discussion really did depend on who was in the room, and we had to think hard about how we bring the right actors into the room at different plays, at different times. Power is really important in those dynamics, and we'd set principles and parameters, but we had to constantly go back and ask people to leave the baggage at the door sometimes, you know, and to forget about, almost unlearn some of the things that we'd bring into meetings and say, work on things together, learn together. That's what we're asking from you, not that you're the CEO of XYZ. Group work requires a lot of work, probably more than you think. Time pressure is constant, and the old world is still grabbing us. In the old world and the new world around teams and everything else, it's grabbing our attention, and that's a constant pressure. There was a disconnect for us around the governance side, and that idea of a steering group sitting on top of a very fast acting, evolving pieces of work around working groups, it was out of sync, and we had to really think about structures, and maybe that's a lesson for us moving forward as well, bring them all into one learning community. Groups started to norm. That whole thing about forming, norming, storming, norming, performing was exactly it. Groups took time to find their stride, but once they did, huge level of energy, enthusiasm. The people who spent the most time wanted to spend the most time going forward, and folks made friends for life. If you can just put it on to the next slide. This is really my final slide. Never assume a level of knowledge or understanding. Always sense check and make sure that everyone is on the same page. You know, dropping things like acronyms, questioning things, challenging things as well, really, really important. Thinking about the group dynamics, icebreakers, get to know each other, appreciative inquiry, really listening well, as important as having your say. There was lots of tensions in there. Honesty, openness, transparency was key to how we move forward. Don't try and change everything or everyone. I think that was the other thing as well. You know, we saw this as an elephant, you know, and this was about small chunks. This was really about an evolving process. And saying we had 10 years, guys, and actually this planning process is the start. We don't have to have everything solved. And then make the process fun was really important. And I think lastly was just about the energy and the context. Remember, just keep people on track, celebrate the successes, take the stress off as well, particularly with the situation that we've been in. And I think that's me. If you want to knock it on to the next slide, there's a little bit of a launch event that we had a few weeks ago, and this was really the outcome of our work. You know, everyone's signing up, people in the room getting enthusiastic, getting behind it. And really, the action plan was really about them all demonstrating their passion for volunteering, because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. That's what makes change. So thank you. I think that's me, Jessica. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alan. Very impressive and lots of slides, but I can't think of a single one that I would have asked you to omit, because they've all been really impactful in telling your story. So thank you very much. Just a practical question. Yes, we will be sending out this entire deck to all registrants. So there have been some questions, excuse me, about that in the chat, but rest assured, you shall receive this. Okay, let's get to questions in our remaining time. This has come up again in Alan's and in Dieter's particularly, so I'm going to pick it up. I did warn you, but let me pick it up directly. And that's this notion of power balance. I think if we're being honest, what we would often say is the power rests with government and the private sector, presumably so. And that often civil society is perceived as not having the same level, the same balance of power when you come into these partnerships. So I want to get right into that. And I want to ask you from your particular perspective, if you're from government, private sector, one of these actors who are perceived to have this power, what do you do to make sure you are actively looking for ways to balance that? If you're from the civil society, which I believe 3 out of the 4 of you are, What tools do you use to challenge those with that perceived power so that they're coming to the table, kind of as Alan says, leaving that baggage out of the room, okay? So if you're from that sector, Helge, we'll start with you. How do you make sure you are truly, truly actively balancing the power? The other three, how do you push back on that? And what is a tool you have used to make sure that you are balancing and actively putting the power share of the volunteering sector where it ought to be? Let's start with Helge, then we'll move to Dieter, Carolina, and Alan. Thank you. Helge?
Thank you very much. I think we look at it from Norek's point of view. We are a government financer, so we have to look at the power balance between the various partners that we are funding, the various organizations linking up together in a partnership to exchange staff and volunteers between them. And I think one approach that we have taken is to really oversee the planning meetings that these partnerships are having, so that we see that not one of the partners in the group really takes over all the planning and steers and directs the rest of them. We have various ways of doing that. One is that we very often are present on these planning meetings, of course having a sort of a not directly operational role, but looking at how the various partners interact. And this is not only to prevent that the Norwegian partners are dominating the Global South partners, but we have a large chunk of South-South cooperation as well. And we also need to see that one southern country is not trying to dominate others in these partnerships. So if we see that this balance is really tipping in an unfavorable way, we can be present and try to by kind means to let everybody have the say, and as I stressed in my presentation, to really accept the knowledge of everybody around the table, because even in planning meetings one can very easily jump into the I would say the trap of thinking that all are, or one side is the teacher and another side is the learner. And I think another important aspect underlying the power balance issue is that the Agenda 2030 is equally valid in the global North and South. So also the North need the knowledge inputs from the South. So it has a very good reason. But then the mechanism is that we accept and we grant, we issue grants when these things are in order. We overlook the power balance, and we try to shift coordination responsibilities, reporting responsibilities, and so on, so that more than one can have a try to coordinate the network. And we are very conscious about this, and they have to use our, in a way, our design of planning, implementation, reporting, and all that. We have elements where we check on the power balance. That's very short answer, Nicole.
No, it's a very thorough answer. You're basically curating the program and making sure that all those voices are heard, all those voices are shared, and that people are coming to it equally. So being an active curator in that process as a partner with recognized power, I think that sounds really, really great. Dieter, what's your tool for holding those accountable? You work with government very, very closely. What is, and I know you've mentioned some of this, but what's one tool you would use to make sure that government is coming to the table, understanding the power that you bring as well?
Thank you very much. I need to say here that one of the key achievements that I got from the IAVE mentorship program was exactly to improve my narrative or my speech on the table. because in that program, with support from Nicole, I could identify some aspects very relevant to CNV about the role of my organization as a platform, you know. And what one of the arguments that we bring on the table is about the role of CNV, because CNV has different role with the government. So here, first of all, is to make clear that as civil society organization or network, in this case, corporate sector, but also the government, we're working for a common goal, which is the well-being of people, you know. So, and positioning volunteer as a tool or as a means through which we can achieve that well-being. And another aspect is that we had a very important event here. Unfortunately, I need to say that in 2019, which was the most devastating cyclone in the history of Mozambique, there was a huge informal volunteering movement. And from that experience, there was a clear understanding from the government about the impact of volunteering. For example, just to mention, we had 45 containers of goods being which were given from by Mozambican people, and all those containers were filled by Mozambican volunteers. So if you could convert this into money, it was a huge amount, you know. So from that experience was a growing understanding from the government about the role of volunteering. And the most and the other thing is that we have had an increased movement from even people, very respected people who have who are speaking in the government with the government that volunteering is essential, something that belongs to the civil society. So CNV has showed the government about his capability in terms of mobilizing volunteers. So if you position ourselves as a platform, that it's as you said, to legitimate volunteering as a platform that has this power in terms of mobilizing people, bringing together to address concrete development issues. That's very important. In the northern region, for example, we have a region, we have places where the teachers who are assigned there by the government are not there because of the safety, but we're using volunteers to continue education programs. You know, by doing that, there is a growing recognition from the government about the role of volunteers. So this is what we have done. Thank you very much.
Dieter, that is just a very, very profound statement and a significant tool to make it clear that government needs get met by including a vibrant volunteer sector. You won't be successful without us. And I can tell you very much in working with Dieter, he made that point, he articulated that point over and over again, which is why he is in the position of having such a close partnership today. But that is a huge tool. Articulating your value and your essential nature of your participation to the success of the project. All right, Carolina, I'm going to turn it over to you, ask you, I'm sorry to be as brief as possible. I know you have tons to say, but what's your tool to make sure that those with that perceived power are held accountable to balancing that power? And then Alan, we'll go straight to you.
Okay, well, I would say in our experience, two things. Work with partnerships, not come to the table with the government on our own, but show that we are part of a larger sector that is mission driven. In that way, our organization was part of 4 or 5 founding organizations of the first Panamanian Chamber of Social Organizations. We understood that as single organizations, we were dispersed. Our bargaining capability is minimized, and that we needed to come together to leverage all that we bring to the table as nonprofits, not only as volunteer organizations, but as social delivery service organizations to that leverage. So we created Capa de Eso, the Panama Chamber of Social Organizations. We started with 5, now we're more than 45 organizations that come together to produce data, evidence, to articulate our positions as a bloc vis-a-vis the government. And obviously to develop and find meaningful partnership opportunities with them. So we are part of that effort. And we have found that that is one way. And I think the other one is what you mentioned at the beginning, which was credibility. When you do what you do well and you try to excel at it and look for the right partnerships internationally, like Points of Light, like Ayabe and others to guide you, and you have credibility within your sector, this is definitely, and you're consistent through time with your mission. This is also something that has helped us a lot to position ourselves with other stakeholders.
Thank you. I'll give my answer, Nicole.
Yes, Alan, please go right ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I just think it's a great question. I mean, I think for us, and it's just picking up, I think, on what Didar said around common vision, for us is absolutely key. And I think we had a bit of a platform there around already having a framework and a common vision that these powerful partners had bought into already. So you're almost playing that back. And then you're telling them, just as Didar had said as well, and Helge as well, that you're part of this. You know, you don't sit distinct from these outcomes and this vision we're trying to achieve. You're actually part of it. So you're part of that system. You need to be involved. So the next bit, I think, is to involve them in some very practical things. What can they do? What is their role within there? We found that, you know, the people we deal with in Scottish Government are a small part, but there's more work that they've got to do within their organisation as well to help. So it's almost like we're starting to focus them on their task and their role. I think just being clear about what the role is, terms of reference, MOUs always help, but you wouldn't rely on them. So I think there's definitely a human aspect to this, human relationships. So you're building up, you're putting things in those terms, you're understanding their pinch points, their tensions, and you're trying to create a situation where there's win-win, where you're winning and they're winning at the same time. And I think that's it. And don't be scared, because difficult questions will emerge for different parties at different times, and just focus on them head on and be honest and open. That was our approach anyway, and that seemed to work.
So much learning there, so much learning. Be authentic, have credibility, codify with MOUs, but don't live by those. Understand that those are flexing and changing all the time. Again, you'll be sent the recording, you'll be sent this presentation. It is chock full of advice for these partnerships. I'm going to try and get in two last questions. So I'm going to ask each of you to be brief. I'm going to go in the reverse order. So Alan, you will be up first. We all know, I think all four of you have said it, partnership is a give and it is a take. Anyone who's been in any partnership, including a marriage, knows that there is compromise and there are things that you gain. Alan, what is the one compromise you have had to make? And what is the one thing above all else that you have gained? I will ask each of you that question. What is the one compromise you have had to make? And what is the one thing that you have gained? I know you've probably made many compromises and gained many, but I'm going to ask you to just say one. I'm going to go to Alan, again, reverse order. Alan, Carolina, Dieter, and end up with Helge. Alan?
Good question. I mean, I think compromise for us was that we went in with almost a perfect process methodology, and compromise for us was to simplify that back down to a level where it was a very simplified version of human learning systems. What we've gained through this process, I think everyone will tell you, it's about relationships, it's about people, it's about the meetings, the connections you've made, and actually the more time you've spent working on those common activities, you cement those relationships. They're going to stand you the test of time, and that's definitely what all of us have gained. We know who to call. We know who to speak to for these issues. We know where to find an answer if they don't know, and that's just such a great thing for the sector.
Go ahead, Carolina, please, and then Dieter, and then Helge.
Thank you. Well, I would say that we have gained so much ever since we began working as a volunteer center in our country. we worked in partnership with many organizations, with private sector, with universities, with schools, with the government, with individual volunteers, with many, many partners, and we have gained breadth and scope of work, because through those partnerships, we can reach many beneficiary populations that perhaps we couldn't. It opens many doors for also sharing our knowledge. And I think what we have most compromised, I'm not sure we've really compromised much, because from the beginning we understood that partnerships are a win-win, and we are happy to engage in them.
Thank you, Carolina. Didar?
Well, in my case, I don't know if this question is directed to me as Didar, or you're asking me as CNV.
Well, in your work on the volunteering sector, so most likely, however you want to answer it, Didar. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, as an individual, I think one of the things that I had to do was to open my hands of opportunities, because as I mentioned in my short biography, I embraced CNV in 2015 to revitalize it. It was in a crisis, and we all know that when you want to rebuild something, it takes Nicole is very aware about that, about the time that I give, the dedication that I give to this work. But I love what my hobby, my employment, my everything, in turn, like a profit. And what I gained is a huge recognition, And as Alan was saying, relationships are very important. So I got that personal recognition from the State Secretary for Youth and Employment. That's why I was appointed to be there, technical advisor. So this is very important for me, because when we work, we think that we think we are just doing and nobody recognized. But when we are invited to play this kind of roles, it's a very indicator about the meaningful work that we are doing. And as CNV, yes, we are also positioning ourselves as a relevant actor. And as I mentioned, we are getting this connection, international connection. Even my presence in this webinar, it's one of the indicators about this recognition, So this is very important, because I couldn't know Caroline or Nicole or Held. So this is important, a very important achievement for me. So relationships are very important. So this is what I can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Didar. Helge?
Thank you very much. I think that compromises are not exceptions, are they? As you say, Nicole, there are compromises every day in a marriage, and I think even life itself, it's always a compromise. So it's almost a philosophical question you are putting out there. I think we compromise also in our work. Of course, we don't achieve 100% equality between partners, and of course we have to support partnerships that are unidimensional in nature. But maybe the last two years under the pandemic, of course, the greatest compromise of all is that we haven't been able to let our volunteers meet with each other. We've had to go virtual. And that is quite serious for an agency which, like ours, just a few years back, we had the slogan, bringing people together. That was quite difficult during the height of the pandemic. So we had to be clever and find ways of letting the partnerships uphold themselves through virtual communication and not throw them out since they could not any longer travel to each other. Now, 2.5 years later, I think we see that we have paid the price, in the sense that the real effect of being people together is now starting to have, you know, we don't get that effect for 2.5 years. So we are wearing thin on our basic concept, and the partners are also wearing thin on this. And I think we all look forward to learn from each other by being together, because that's our basic mission. And we hope that this autumn we will reverse this trend, and we have already started to send out or facilitate the sending and receiving of volunteers around the world. And we hope this will add back the quality of programs. And of course, at least on that point, we don't need to compromise anymore. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Helge. And I think we're unfortunately going to need to leave it there. I think you all have brought up such incredible learning about being in the room, being authentic, make sure you have the people in the room who are going to be able to drive these partnerships forward, hold people accountable to their behaviors, make sure you've got those documents, but also understand that these are human systems run and by humans, and therefore curating that process, making sure you're looking after that to ensure the balance of power, to ensure voices are heard. Be legitimate, have your own credibility, and make sure you push for that recognition, as Didar said, and make sure you really understand your own value and the value you bring. All make for fantastic partnerships. All right, so just before we go, speaking of bringing people together, I want to draw your attention to the next session in this 3-part series, which will happen on September 22nd, where we will look at the often quoted, mentioned subject of an enabling environment for volunteering. Do be sure to join us for that. Also, hopefully, Jess, do we have a slide on the World Volunteering Conference? Excellent, thank you. Speaking of bringing people together, as Helge mentioned, and this yearn we have to actually physically be together, I hope you'll come and join us at the 26th World Volunteer Conference in Abu Dhabi. I noted that one of our speakers and participants from Ma'an, a community organization working with governments, was on the call today. They've got some fantastic partnerships that I hope you'll all hear, but please do come and join us. The website is absolutely there. Go and register. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to us. Also, we have just put out a phenomenal report on corporate volunteering. The link is there. Do check it out, because remember, this notion of partnership with corporations and government has become increasingly important for us to be successful in our work. It only leaves it for me to say thank you to the panelists. We caught you in airports, at dinner time, in the middle of your day, but I wouldn't have wanted to miss any one of you on this call. You have been absolutely brilliant, and we thank you so much, not only for your participation today, but for your participation in our global network for volunteer leaders, and for your participation in our beloved stakeholder community. Thank you to Ayave, to Jess, Han, our comms manager, and Wendy Osborne, senior advisor, who works so very hard behind the scenes to bring these all together. And thank you to our participants out there. You enable us to do this work. None of us could do this work without this global community of volunteers. So thank you to everyone. Be well, be successful, and we hope we see you soon.